Hi, everyone. I am so happy to be here with one of my new favorite people, David Hoffman, the director of the Center for Democracy and Civic Life at University of Maryland, Baltimore County, and an OG of the American Democracy Project. I am Amanda Taylor, and I am the Assistant Vice President for Civic and Global Engagement at AASCU, the American Association of State Colleges and Universities. And we're here today to talk a little bit about a really powerful document that David and colleagues about 10 years ago authored. And it has become really a guiding framework for how the American Democracy Project has operated. For those of us who are, including me, who are newer to the American Democracy Project, we're excited to have the opportunity to talk with you, David, a little bit more so we can understand some of the founding principles of the project as we look to the next chapter of the work. We really want to make sure that we ground it in the incredible work and thinking of those of you who have been foundational to this effort and will continue to be moving forward. So thanks for being willing to talk with me today.
Pleasure.
So, David, can you tell us a little bit about, in academia, we like to have long titles for things, lots of colons in our titles. But I'm wondering if you could share a little bit in kind of in plain terms, how would you describe the core idea behind this framework that has served to guide ADP's work over the past decade?
There's a quote from the philosopher John Dewey that's been cited a number of times at American Democracy Project meetings. He said, democracy has to be enacted anew in every year and day, in every generation and every year and day, in the living relations of person to person in all social forms and institutions. He wrote that in 1937. But I would say that is the core idea of the theory of change, that democracy is a form of government, but it's also a way of life that can be enacted in everyday settings. And when it's not enacted in everyday settings, that's to our detriment. So it matters that if we are eligible to register and vote, that we do that. It matters that we engage in acts of charity and service, but it also matters that we are able to find each other and build power together and communicate across differences in identity, experience, perspective, in all of the institutions in which we enact our lives, meaning our neighborhoods, our workplaces, our colleges and universities, all the institutions where we spend our time together, wherever people gather, all of that counts. And so, as civic educators, we ought to be building students' knowledge, skills, and dispositions to prepare them to participate in all of those settings, in building power together and creating communities in which everyone can thrive.
Mm. Thanks, David. Yes. I am sitting here actually looking at my John Dewey book on my bookshelf. So we share a love for John Dewey and his great work. We've exposed our nerddom. So thank you for that gorgeous vision. And so, in looking through this theory of change that you just described, something that really struck me is it doesn't just focus on student learning, right? But it also really looks at kind of more broadly campus culture and kind of everyday practices, how we interact with each other every day on campus. Um, can you talk a little bit more why that's an important shift?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that actually is a focus on student learning. It just incorporates the recognition that students learn outside of the programs and courses that we have designed to teach them lessons about civics. They're learning from their entire experience, consciously or unconsciously. And so if they have wonderful, empowering, connective experiences in our courses and programs, and elsewhere in their experience in college, they experience themselves as customers without
Mm,
power, or in which
mm,
power relations are invisible to them, without the opportunities to build meaningful connections across differences in identity and role. They're going to internalize some very unhelpful civics
mm,
lessons,
mhm,
including that they only have power when they are in an experience that is named as an experience in which they have power. And
mm,
so, a part of the insight there is that it matters. Their entire environment matters, and their entire environment is teaching them. In addition to that, if as a faculty or staff member you are in an institution in which the norms are undemocratic norms, where everywhere is hierarchy and sort of the instrumentalization of people and you don't have the opportunity to experience yourself as being a part of a thriving community, it is going to be hard for you to communicate to students empowering civic lessons. So it matters the experiences that non-students have as well.
Hmm. Yeah, I really appreciate that. I think I've thought a lot about and written about in the past that what we call the hidden curriculum,
Mhm.
right, of higher education. And I think you're really speaking into that, that our students are learning inside, outside the classroom, and in, maybe even more powerfully in spaces that we don't designate as these are the places where you learn how to do civic life, how to do democratic participation. Um, thank you for that. So, for people that are listening to this vision that you're laying out, um, how might they get started, right? It's one thing to be inspired by this work, but I wonder if you could say one practical step that campus leaders, faculty, staff, students could take to begin enacting this vision. How do we go from theory into practice?
Yeah, if we think of this vision as democratic practices are everywhere,
Mhm.
and we are attuned to the possibilities of democratic life across our institutions. I think what can be very helpful and empowering is to recognize where those practices already exist by names other than
Mm,
civic learning and democratic engagement. Because I think for a lot of people who are civic educators, you have a sense that you can control the environments that you can control. They're within your job description, but everything else is kind of out of reach. So, in my own institution, we went through a very empowering, important connective process about 15 years ago of talking with each other about where these practices already showed up or where people aspired to enact them but didn't have the words and didn't have
mm,
a sense that their particular campus setting was one that was appropriate for it. And it just revealed all kinds of civic passion, civic energy,
mm,
concern for building communities in which everyone can thrive. It was all going by different names. And so I would be thinking about and taking inventory of and building connections to parts of the institution that may be adjacent to the work that you're doing, that may be a little further away, but where people are also pursuing this objective of building a democratic culture.
yeah, thank you. It's a great idea, and I think we can all do that. So, as we look ahead, um, to the next decade, 2 decades of this work, what do you see as the most important next step for this field?
Oh,
Where are we going, and how do we start to get there?
yeah, I think we need to move away from a model where we treat civic learning as sort of a discipline parallel to chemistry and engineering and political
Mm,
science,
mm,
and think of it as a set of practices and insights that can be learned in many settings on campus. So, what that means is that we might continue to have civic centers on campuses because they're going to be hubs of activity. But really, I imagine civic educators becoming consultants to all of the other educators within
mm,
institutions, including faculty and staff and student leaders, because all of them create the environments in which students learn. So I imagine that 15, 20 years from now, you can be a STEM major who is learning about how to be an effective practitioner within your discipline or an effective scholar, but the way that you're learning it, the way that you're collaborating with people in the learning, the way that you're projecting forward into careers and recognizing the civic dimensions of those careers and the ways that democratic life can play out within workplaces, within laboratories, that all of that would be a part of your civic learning.
mm.
And whether or not you named it as such, right? But that that being a student in any of our institutions, you would have 1,000 different ways of getting a really empowering civics education that connects you with people in ways that build your skills to connect with people across difference and build thriving communities.
Yeah, that's great. You're talking about really how do we open the tent and break down the silos and connect the dots for people. And I think it's an incredible vision and really an important next step for us for sure. So, you just mentioned the word thriving, and I think that's another word we talk about all the time in this work, and don't always actually define what we mean. So I wonder if I could just push you a little bit to say, if you had to say in maybe one sentence, we could give you two if you really need it, David. But if you had to say in one sentence, what does a thriving democracy look like?
Mhm,
Um, and what is the role of colleges and universities in building that? What would you say?
mhm. I think in a thriving democracy, everyone matters and everyone belongs.
Mm,
And by mattering, I mean they experience agency. They have a sense that they can make choices and work together to shape the conditions in which they live. And by belonging, I mean they are connected with each other in ways that allow them to experience their own and each other's common humanity.
mm.
We feel that we are a part of a larger thing that we can touch and shape together, and we can feel good about doing it.
Yeah. Thank you. David, this has been so great to have this chance to talk with you. I'm feeling really inspired to go share this and to continue this work forward. And I wonder, as we close out, could you share a little bit about 10 years ago why you felt like um, within the American Democracy Project you needed to create this document? What was the impulse then? And do you see us at another moment now to need to continue that work in any way? How do you think about that?
Yeah. There was an ADP meeting years ago, more than 10 years ago, where George Mahaffey, the founder of the American Democracy Project, or one of its founders, would talk each year actually about how too many of the earlier projects in ADP were marginal, episodic, and celebratory.
Hmm,
And I heard those words a few times before I really started to engage them and thought about, well, what would the opposite of
hmm,
marginal, episodic, and celebratory be? I actually asked this at a meeting to George in response to, because he had made this point and they called for questions. And I kept thinking about that and started to have conversations with other people in the network about what that would entail, and ultimately landed on the idea of experiences that were integral, relational, organic, and generative, a
hmm,
part of our lives, a part of our learning. And from there started to ask myself, like, it is helpful if you're frustrated about something like projects being marginal, episodic, and celebratory to have a vision of the alternative. And if you were frustrated, as many of us were at the time, with sort of the conditions in our democracy, the ways in which people experienced um, an absence of agency and an absence of connection, to be able to envision what is the democracy that we're trying to build together through our work. And so we started to have those conversations. What would that mean? And actually, really, it was about coming to recognize that conversation is valuable for our entire network.
hmm,
So the immediate place that went was to the design of the 2017 American Democracy Project meeting, where we posed the question, what are the key features of the thriving democracy we are trying to create and enact through our work? And collected answers to that question. That was an incredibly generative conversation, post-it notes up all over the room, and people connecting over thinking through that vision. And from those contributions, a group of us wrote the document that you referred to, the thing that we've called the theory of change, that both used those contributions. So the vision that people had for a thriving democracy was one where in both governmental and non-governmental settings, in everyday settings, people felt empowered and connected and able to shape their circumstances. And we started to play out in conversation. So, what would, if that is the vision for a thriving democracy, and we came up with a way of naming sort of values that would hold true in every setting in society, decency and wisdom and um, humanity. How would you teach for that?
hmm.
What are the things that you would need to know in order to be able to create and contribute to that kind of democracy? Because that ought to inform then what we're doing at our institutions. So we identified question, a learning outcomes question, a pedagogy question, and a strategy question. And that last one was, so now that we have thought through how might you teach toward that democracy, how can we create the space for that within our institutions? What would that actually look like? What would an institution that embraced democratic practices look like, and how would you get there? And so wrote these essays responding to that challenge in order to bring the complete set of essays to the 2018 meeting and have the group engage it and have conversations about that. So I would say that entire process was just incredibly generative and produced all kinds of good feelings. Now, as a practical matter, some of that stuff is a little heady when you're operating in the day to day and you've got, I have my class, I have my programs, I have, scrambling to try and get budgets and fulfill institutional mandates, to think expansively about what could democracy look like and how might I contribute to it is a challenge that I think we continue to grapple with. But that was the origin of it. And to me, the question of what is the thriving democracy our work is directed at building, and how do we teach toward it? Those are still live questions, and the conditions in our democracy that sort of inspired us to start to brainstorm about that, the adverse conditions have only been exacerbated
Mhm.
since then. So we have a lot of work to do.
We absolutely do. And I think it's clear to me that, and I think to you too, the only way we can do this work is together. And the only way we can do this work is grounded in many of these really critical foundational principles that you and the team outlined. So I'm looking forward to us continuing that work and hopefully using this ADP convening this year actually in March as yet another opportunity to really vision forward collectively.
I want to make two more points inspired
Yeah.
by your earlier questions, if that's okay. One is
Please.
I think a part of what is hopeful about all of this is that the craving, the yearning to matter and belong is universal. That is not a partisan kind of yearning. I think to the extent that people are frustrated with our politics at this time, whatever your partisan perspective, it is because you feel like you don't matter and you don't belong. And it is
Mhm.
hard to envision pathways toward mattering and belonging.
Mhm.
So I deeply appreciate that the appeal of that crosses party lines.
Mhm.
And the other thing is, you asked earlier about like what can institutions do to contribute in this moment? And I think a lot of educators operate on the premise that our impact is sort of a generational impact in the sense that we teach students who are empowered, inspired, who develop knowledge and skills, and they go out into the world and change it. And I think that is a part of the impact that colleges and universities can have. But I think there's even a more immediate impact, which is if we can become thriving institutions that model the democracy we're hoping to create, that our thriving can inspire people, can be a model for people in the present day. So we
Mhm.
can change the present and the future at the same time.
I love that. And university is really a lab for that future building work, and
Yeah,
a model for engaging collectively and how we do that every day. So um, thank you, David. I think that hope is well needed right now and also a grounded hope. I mean, there's things each of us can do every day in and outside of our campuses that build toward that vision you're describing and help make other folks feel that they matter. And in the process, feeling a sense of belonging for ourselves as well and knitting that social fabric. So thank you. It's been great to spend this time with you, and I'm really excited for our future and the future of ADP.
likewise.